Welcome back to the deep dive. I want to start today with a little temporal experiment, if you will.
Oh, an experiment. Okay, I'm game.
Yeah, so I want you to cast your mind back to January 1st. Can you see it? The crisp air, the fresh calendar page, that
intoxicating feeling of a blank slate.
Exactly, that blank slate. Now, flash forward to today. Be honest with me. And with yourself, really, how wide is the chasm between the person you swore you were going to be this year and the person who actually woke up this morning?
Yeah, it's the perennial question, isn't it? The gap between the ideal self and the actual self.
The chasm is usually pretty wide.
It is. In behavioral psychology, we actually refer to this as the intention-behavior gap. It's a well-documented phenomena.
Meaning we all do it.
We all do it. Our explicit intentions, things like, I will learn Italian, or I will code an app, they have almost zero correlation with our subsequent behavior.
Zero.
Statistically, very close to zero, unless specific architectural interventions are made.
Architectural interventions. I like that phrasing because that is exactly what we are doing today.
Yeah.
We are architecting growth.
I like the sound of that.
And we aren't here to guilt trip you about your failed resolutions. We've all been there. The alarm goes off. It's cold. The bed is warm.
And suddenly that grand cinematic vision of running a marathon at dawn just completely dissolves.
It just vanishes.
Yeah.
Whew. So what we want to explore today is why that happens and, more importantly, how to build a structure that prevents it.
Precisely. We need to move away from the concept of motivation. Motivation is just a feeling. It's a neurochemical spike of dopamine that is, by definition, temporary.
Right. It fades.
You cannot build a house on a foundation of feelings. You need a blueprint. You need architecture.
And to help us draft this blueprint, we are analyzing a really rich conversation today. It's from the Learning English podcast.
Yes, featuring Emma and John.
Right, Emma and John. Now, on the surface, this source material looks like a casual catch-up. Just two friends discussing their plans for the upcoming year.
But when you strip away the pleasantries, what they're actually doing is conducting a sort of master class in cognitive restructuring.
It really is. I was amazed at how dense it was.
Yeah, I was struck by how intuitively they grasped some very high-level concepts in educational psychology and behavioral science.
They touch on so many things.
They do. They get into andragogy, which is adult learning theory. They dive into synaptic pruning via habit formation, and they even get into the neuroscience of error processing.
So our mission today is to act as the site managers for this construction project. We're going to take the raw materials Emma and John provide in this source, concepts like project-based learning, habit stacking, social learning, and figure out the structural engineering behind them.
We want to understand the mechanisms of why these strategies work.
Exactly. So you can stop relying on sheer willpower and start relying on design. Let's break ground with the first major pillar of their discussion.
The pedagogical shift.
Yes. It starts with Emma. She's talking about her professional development, specifically aiming for a certification in project-based learning, or PBL.
PBL is a fascinating area.
It is, but I think for a lot of us, the word certification triggers a Pavlovian response of boredom.
Oh, absolutely.
We think of standardized tests, Scantron sheets, memorizing endless definitions.
Which is ironic because that is exactly the model of education that Dismantling is designed to dismantle. Emma describes her shift toward PBL as a move away from rote memorization.
We need to pause on that term because rote memorization is the default setting for most independent learners.
It's what we're taught in school. You buy a textbook, you make flashcards, you try to hammer facts into your brain through sheer repetition.
Right. It's the fill the bucket model. You assume your brain is an empty vessel and you just pour information in.
But Emma notes that with PBL, the engagement in her students is palpable. She's seeing a completely different level of neural firing.
And why is that? What's happening under the hood?
She's tapping into what cognitive scientists call the generation effect. Information is remembered much better if it's generated from one's own mind rather than simply read.
So reading is passive.
Exactly. When you are doing rote memorization, you are passive. You are just a consumer of information. But in project-based learning, you are a producer.
She defines it as acquiring knowledge by actively engaging in real-world, personally meaningful projects. So instead of studying the theory of aerodynamics in a textbook,
you build a model plane that actually needs to fly.
Yes. And let's look at the why here. Why does this work so much better?
It comes down to contextualization. When you learn a fact in isolation, say, a vocabulary word or a coding function, your brain files it away as abstract data. It has no hook to hang on to.
It's just floating out there.
Right. But if you learn that coding function because you specifically need it to make a button work on a website you're building for your portfolio,
Oh, I see.
that piece of information gets welded to a specific problem solution set in your brain.
John, the other voice in our source material, he latches onto this immediately. He frames it through the lens of autonomy.
Yes, autonomy is huge here.
He says that PBL creates a natural environment for autonomy, which he views as the holy grail of engagement.
He's referencing self-determination theory here, whether he realizes it or not. Ryan and DC's work on motivation posits that autonomy is one of the 3 basic psychological needs.
Okay, so how does that play out in learning?
When we feel forced to learn something like rote memorization, often feels we naturally resist. It's the have to versus want to dynamic. But when you are building a project, you need the information to solve a puzzle you actually care about.
It creates an intrinsic need to know.
Precisely.
So if we're applying this blueprint to you, the listener, let's say you're trying to learn history, the bad architecture way is to just read a thick history book cover to cover.
You'll be asleep by chapter 3.
Right. The Emma way, the PBL way, is to say, I'm going to produce a 10-minute documentary on the French Revolution for YouTube.
Yes, because the output drives the input.
Right.
The moment you decide to make that documentary, the way you read changes entirely.
You aren't just scanning text anymore.
No, you're hunting for narrative. You're looking for specific details to illustrate a point. You are engaging in active retrieval and synthesis, which are much higher order cognitive functions than simple recognition.
It changes your whole posture. You stop being a student and you start being a creator.
It's a massive shift.
Now, John takes this concept and tries to map it onto his own struggle. And this is where we get to the real foundation of the house. He's struggling with language learning, specifically Spanish.
This is a classic case study. John describes himself as having basic proficiency. He can order a coffee, he can find the bathroom.
But he's hitting that intermediate plateau.
Exactly. And he admits something very vulnerable here. He says he starts every year with a burst of enthusiasm that inevitably fades away.
We really need to talk about that burst, because I think our culture absolutely fetishes the start.
We love a good beginning.
We love the montage sequence in movies where the hero decides to change their life, buys all the gear, wakes up early. We love the energy of day one.
But John notices that the burst is actually a trap.
A trap? How so?
The burst is a trap because it masks the friction of the task. When dopamine is high during that initial burst of enthusiasm, you don't notice that studying for an hour is inconvenient.
You're riding the wave.
Right. But as soon as the novelty wears off, which is usually around the 3-week mark for most people, the dopamine drops. And suddenly, you were left with the friction.
And John talks about the cognitive load of just deciding to start.
That phrase, cognitive load, is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
It really is. Unpack that for us.
Think of your willpower as a battery. Every decision you make during the day drains that battery a little bit. What to wear, what to eat, answering emails, navigating traffic.
Decision fatigue.
Exactly. So if you get to 6 p.m. and you have to decide when to study Spanish, where to find your books, and what chapter to read, the battery is completely dead.
You just won't do it. You'll turn on the TV.
You'll take the path of least resistance.
So the friction isn't the studying itself. It's the administrative work of setting up the studying.
Correct. The negotiation with yourself is what's exhausting. And this is why Emma's intervention here is arguably the most critical part of this architectural plan. She introduces habit stacking.
Habit stacking. This is a term popularized by James Clear, but the mechanism goes back much further, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. Emma defines it as anchoring a new habit to an existing established one.
And she uses the perfect example from John's own life, his morning coffee.
It's brilliant.
Let's scrutinize why this specific example works, because it's not just about the caffeine waking him up. John says he drinks coffee without fail.
Without fail. That means the neural pathway for wake up, go to kitchen, brew coffee is heavily myelinated. It is a superhighway in his brain.
He doesn't have to negotiate with himself to drink coffee. It's completely automatic.
It's a basal ganglia function. It's on autopilot. So by saying, after I pour my coffee, I will look at Spanish flashcards, he is hijacking that existing neural superhighway.
He's piggybacking on it.
Psychologists call this implementation intentions. It's an if-then plan. If coffee, then Spanish.
This removes the decision-making entirely. The coffee cup itself becomes the trigger.
It utilizes context cues. Our brains are associative machines. If you try to study at random times, your brain has to basically reboot into study mode every single time.
Which takes energy.
Exactly. But if you link studying to the smell of the coffee, the weight of the mug, the morning light coming through the window.
It becomes a package deal.
Eventually, the smell of coffee alone will prime your brain for vocabulary acquisition. You are outsourcing the discipline to the environment.
It's brilliant in its efficiency. You aren't building a new foundation. You're just adding a room onto a house that's already standing.
And notice how John expands this strategy. He doesn't just stop at Spanish. He applies it to his goal of learning to code.
Right. His trigger for coding is reading the morning news.
And his habit. This is the really interesting part. He commits to just 15 minutes of a tutorial.
15 minutes. That brings us to the concept of micro-habits and activation energy.
Yes. In chemistry, activation energy is the minimum energy required to start a reaction. In human behavior, it's the effort required to get off the couch.
By setting the goal at just 15 minutes, John is lowering the activation energy to almost zero.
He's making it too easy to fail.
I think a lot of listeners might scoff at 15 minutes, though. They'll say, I can't learn Python in 15 minutes a day. I need to do deep work for 4 hours.
And that is the all-or-nothing fallacy. If you aim for 4 hours, the activation energy is massive. You will procrastinate. You will find a reason not to do it today.
I don't have 4 hours today, so I'll just do nothing.
Exactly. But by aiming for 15 minutes, you ensure the behavior actually happens. And here's the secret. Once you start, you very often keep going.
The hardest part is the first 60 seconds.
Newton's first law, right? An object in motion stays in motion.
But even if he only does 15 minutes, he's still winning, isn't he?
He is, because he is maintaining the habit loop. He is casting a vote for his identity as a coder.
Donald Hebb's famous axiom applies here.
Yes. Neurons that fire together wire together. Frequency matters way more than duration when you are establishing a new behavior.
Okay, so if the architecture of the daily routine is handled by habit stacking, let's look at the framework of the learning itself. We need to go back to John's language struggle.
The Spanish plateau.
Right. He mentions that even with habits in place, he feels stagnant using apps. He says they lack the dynamic nature of conversation.
This is a really profound critique of gamified learning. Apps are what we call closed loops.
Closed loops, meaning they're predictable.
Very predictable. You see a prompt, you type a response, you get a ding. It's a sterile, perfectly controlled environment.
Real language isn't like that.
Real language is an open loop. It's chaotic, it's noisy, and it's highly unpredictable.
John calls it passive consumption. He feels like he's just eating the language rather than cooking with it.
And that passivity is exactly why he can't break through to fluency. He is lacking contextual interference.
What does that mean in practice?
When you use an app, the variables are controlled. When you speak to a human being, you have to process tone, body language, slang, random interruptions, background noise.
It's a much heavier cognitive lift.
Yes, which brings us to Emma's suggestion to solve this, the language exchange partner.
The symbiotic solution. Find a native speaker who wants to learn English and swap.
This introduces social risk, which is an incredibly powerful architectural element.
Talk about social risk, because most people try to avoid risk.
They do. When you are alone on your couch with an app, if you get a question wrong, the cost is literally zero. Maybe you lose a virtual heart. Who cares?
Right.
But when you are speaking to a living, breathing human, if you get it wrong, there's a slight spike in cortisol. You feel a tiny bit of embarrassment.
And that little bit of embarrassment is actually a glue for memory.
It is. Evolutionarily, we are wired to remember social interactions because they determine our status in the tribe. That heightened state of arousal, not panic, but alertness, makes the memory sticky.
So if you struggle to find the word for umbrella in a rainstorm with a real Italian person,
you will never, ever forget that word again. Your brain flags it as socially important.
That connects beautifully back to his why, doesn't it? He talks about wanting to travel to the Dolomites or Venice.
Yes, he makes a very specific distinction. He wants cultural assimilation, not just sightseeing.
That is the difference between being a tourist and being a traveler. A tourist observes the house from the street. A traveler wants to come inside and sit by the fire.
Beautifully put. John wants to understand the soul of the place, and that desire creates an emotional anchor.
Explain that concept. How does an emotional anchor actually change the architecture of the goal?
Well, logic is a very weak driver of behavior. Knowing that Spanish is good for my resume is a logical argument. It's weak.
It won't get you out of bed.
Exactly. But imagining yourself laughing at a joke in a busy cafe in Barcelona, that is visceral. That image pulls you through the drudgery of the flashcards. It gives the brain a vivid reward to anticipate.
Let's shift gears to the interior design of this life we're building. We need to talk about milestones. Because John brings up a trap that I think is responsible for more abandoned hobbies than anything else.
The rock star fallacy.
The dusty guitar syndrome. It is tragic. John admits he wants to nurture his creative side, so he goes out and buys a guitar.
But his mental image is likely him playing a complex, face-melting solo on stage.
Right, and that goal is so abstract and so distant that it is paralyzing. It looms over you.
It creates a sense of low self-efficacy. Albert Bandura, the psychologist who coined that term, argued that our belief in our ability to succeed drives our actual effort.
So if the goal is be a rock star, your self-efficacy is near zero because you have no idea how to even begin getting there.
So John pivots. He changes the goal from learn guitar to learn 3 chords by January.
That is goal hierarchy in action. He is taking a superordinate goal, be musical, and breaking it down into a subordinate, highly concrete action, 3 chords.
It seems almost too small, though, doesn't it? 3 chords.
It has to be small, because hitting that target provides a dopamine release. It manufactures a win.
Exactly.
When he learns those 3 chords, his brain says, hey, I'm good at this, let's do more. It creates a positive feedback loop.
Emma applies this exact same rigor to her photography. She has a sophisticated DSLR camera.
Which is another classic example of buying the identity before having the skill.
Totally. And she admits she's completely overwhelmed by all the buttons and dials.
Information overload. A modern DSLR has hundreds of settings. If you try to learn them all simultaneously, you learn none.
You experience a cognitive bottleneck. So her strategy is variable isolation.
She says, I will master 1 setting each month. January is aperture, February is shutter speed.
By isolating the variable, she allows herself to deeply understand the cause and effect relationship of that one single dial.
She is building a mental model of the camera 1 brick at a time rather than trying to throw up the whole wall at once.
It's a powerful lesson in constraint. We tend to think total freedom is good for learning, but actually constraints are what allow us to focus.
Constraints breed creativity and mastery. But, and here is the reality check, even with micro habits, even with isolated variables, the roof is going to leak sometimes.
You are going to mess up.
And this brings us to the psychology of failure. Emma uses the old idiom in the source material, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs.
It is a cliche, but let's deconstruct it. Why do we hate that phrase? Because we still view the broken egg as a waste. We view it as a loss.
But John loves it. He talks about rebranding failure. He calls the mistakes data points.
Now, that is a massive shift. That's moving from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset, as Carol Dweck would put it.
But it goes deeper than just a positive attitude, right?
Much deeper. By calling them data points, John is engaging in cognitive distancing. He is separating his ego from the error.
Explain that mechanism for us. What happens in the brain?
When we make a mistake, say, butchering a sentence in Italian, our brain generates a signal called error-related negativity, or EARN.
EARN.
Got it. It's a distress signal. If your ego is wrapped up in being smart or perfect, that EARN signal feels like a direct threat to your identity. You feel shame.
And shame causes you to quit.
Exactly. But if it's just data?
If it's data, the EARN signal is just information. It's feedback. John mentions burning sourdough bread.
Yes. If he views himself as a master baker, burning the bread is a crisis.
But if he views himself as a scientist in the kitchen,
then burning the bread is just a result of the oven being 10 degrees too hot. It's physics, not character.
Physics, not character. I think that needs to be tattooed on some foreheads.
It's a great mantra.
They apply this to professional anxiety as well. John mentions he's up for a promotion that requires public speaking, and he finds it daunting.
Public speaking is fascinating because it triggers the spotlight effect. We vastly overestimate how much people are noticing our flaws. We think everyone in the room is analyzing our every twitch.
Emma gives him a 2-part reframing strategy for this. First, she says public speaking is a skill, not an innate talent.
That's the growth mindset again.
Right. But the second part is what I found really profound. She tells him to shift his focus from his own nervousness to the value he is providing the audience.
This is the shift from egocentric to service-centric. It is an absolute anxiety killer.
How does that kill the anxiety?
As long as John is thinking, do I look smart? Is my voice shaking? What do they think of me? He is in a hyper-vigilant defensive state. He is actively protecting his ego.
But if he thinks, I have information that can help these people,
then the brain reprioritizes. The primary goal becomes the transmission of helpful data, not the protection of self.
Oh, wow.
The physiological arousal, the racing heart, the sweating is actually reinterpreted by the brain not as fear, but as excitement or readiness to serve. It fundamentally changes the chemical cocktail in your body.
We have built quite a structure here today. We have the foundation of habit stacking, the framework of project-based learning, the interior milestones, and the stress testing of failure as data.
It's a solid house.
But there is one final element John mentions that acts as the zoning laws for this whole project. He looks at his list: volunteering, painting, coding, traveling, language learning, and he admits it feels like a lot.
The overwhelm check. This is where most architectural plans completely collapse.
Yeah.
We over-design.
We try to build a mansion when we only have the budget for a cabin.
Exactly. And Emma's response is the safety valve. She talks about adaptability.
This is crucial. We tend to view our goals as static monuments. I said I would do this in January, so I absolutely must do it in June.
But Emma argues that life is fluid.
She says goals set in January might need to evolve.
This touches on the sunk cost fallacy. We often stick to a goal just because we've already invested time or money in it, even if it no longer serves us. Emma is advocating for strategic abandonment.
That sounds controversial. Strategic abandonment. Won't people just use that as an excuse to quit when things get hard?
There's a difference between quitting because of friction and quitting because of misalignment. If you realize in April that learning to code is making you miserable and it doesn't align with your career path anymore, sticking with it isn't grit.
It's just stubbornness.
It's stupidity. It's rigid perfectionism. The goal is continuous growth, not blind obedience to a past version of yourself.
It's like renovating the house while you're living in it. You might realize the kitchen needs to be bigger and the library smaller. That's not a failure of the original blueprint. It's just an adaptation to reality.
Precisely. And the compass for that adaptation is the why. John ends the conversation by planning to list the why behind every single goal.
He lists the mindfulness of baking bread, the altruism of volunteering at an animal shelter, the thrill of understanding a joke in Spanish.
Notice the nature of these whys. They are all intrinsic. He isn't listing status or money or impressing his neighbors. He is listing internal states of being.
Enriching life experience.
That is the ultimate sustainable fuel. Extrinsic motivation rewards, praise it burns hot and fast. Intrinsic motivation, curiosity, joy, mastery, it burns slow and long.
So if you enjoy the process of baking, the smell, the tactile sensation of the dough, you will bake for a lifetime.
But if you only want the Instagram photo of the bread, you'll quit as soon as the algorithm changes.
It brings us back to that idea of joy in the journey. It sounds like a bumper sticker, but strictly from a behavioral standpoint, it's a survival mechanism for habits.
It absolutely is. If the journey is miserable, the brain will eventually revolt. You have to engineer joy into the architecture.
So let's do a final walkthrough of the building we've constructed today. It's a dense blueprint, but I think it's highly actionable.
It is, and the components are modular. You can use what you need.
First, we have the pedagogical shift. Don't just act as a bucket for information. Use project-based learning. Be the architect, not the passive observer. The output drives the input.
Second, we have habit stacking. Don't rely on willpower. Hijack your existing neural superhighways. Use the morning coffee to trigger the flashcards. Reduce the cognitive load.
Third, micro-habits. Overcome activation energy by making the task comically small, 15 minutes. Lower the barrier until you simply can't say no.
Fourth, social learning. Step out of the closed loop of the app and into the open loop of real conversation. Embrace the social risk to create sticky memories.
Fifth, specific milestones. Avoid the rockstar fallacy. Isolate variables like aperture or guitar chords. Manufacture wins to build your self-efficacy.
Sixth, reframing failure. It's just data. Decouple your ego from the error signal. Use the mistake to calibrate the system. Physics, not character.
And finally, adaptability. Be willing to change the plans. Listen to the why. If the house doesn't fit you anymore, knock down a wall.
It's a robust system. It moves us from wishing to engineering.
So here is my challenge to you, the listener. I want you to look at your own life. Don't look at the whole year. Just look at tomorrow morning. What is your coffee? What is that unshakable habit you already have? And what is one tiny 5-minute block of growth you can stack on top of it?
Start with a foundation. Lay one single brick.
And as you build, ask yourself the question we touched on at the end. If the goal is the journey, do you have the courage to quit a path that is leading you nowhere? What happens if you reach June and realize the goal you set in January is no longer the goal you actually want?
That is the ultimate question of architectural integrity. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is tear up the blueprints and draw new ones.
Is the courage to quit a goal just as important as the discipline to stick to one? Something to mull over as you mix your mortar today. A huge thank you to the Learning English podcast for providing the site survey for today's deep dive.
Keep building.
We'll see you next time.
So, welcome back to the deep dive. I want to start today by asking you to just visualize a really specific corner of your house.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, you know the one I'm talking about. We all have one. It might be like the back of a closet, maybe the space under your bed, or just a drawer you haven't opened in probably 6 months.
A drawer of guilt, usually.
Exactly. It's the place where you keep those really expensive running shoes you wore, I think exactly twice. It's where the Italian grammar workbooks are stacked right next to the professional watercolor set.
And the sourdough starter kit.
Yes. Sourdough starter kit you bought during that huge burst of inspiration a few years ago.
Ah, yes. The graveyard of good intentions. We definitely all have one of those.
We really do. The graveyard. And I think every single person listening right now has felt this specific cycle just, deep in their bones. You get this massive rush of dopamine.
You buy the gear.
Right. You buy the gear, you download the language app, you tell all your friends, this is it. This is the new me. And for about 2 weeks, it actually is the new you.
You're completely crushing it.
You feel unstoppable. But then something happens. The drift sets in. The shoes just kind of stay in the closet.
The app notifications get muted.
Or turned off entirely, yeah. The sketchbook gathers dust.
And usually when that happens, the very first question we ask ourselves is, what is wrong with me?
Right. Why did I stop?
Exactly. We blame our willpower. We blame our own discipline.
We internalize it as a character flaw, like we're just fundamentally lazy. But today, based on the source material we've been analyzing, we are going to flip that entire narrative completely on its head.
Completely.
Because the question isn't, why do we stop? I mean, we are incredibly good at starting things. The real question is, how do we engineer a life where we actually can't stop?
Right.
How do we sustain that momentum when the new car smell of a goal completely fades away?
Because relying on willpower alone is just a losing strategy. That is really the core premise of the conversation we are unpacking today.
So let's talk about the source for this deep dive.
Right. So we have this transcript from a really fascinating dialogue between two individuals, Emma and John. And this comes from a recorded dialogue titled The Learning English Podcast.
Which is a bit of a misnomer.
It is, yeah. I want to be super clear right off the bat. If you just skimmed this text on the surface, you'd probably say, oh, okay, this is a nice little chat about learning Spanish and Japanese.
Just some language learning tips.
Exactly. But when we actually peeled back the layers, which is obviously what we do here, we realize that the language learning aspect is really just a Trojan horse.
It's not really about languages at all, is it?
No, not at all. It is a blueprint. It's almost like a structural engineering report for personal growth in literally any field.
Wow.
Yeah. Whether you are trying to learn to code in Python or learn how to bake sourdough, which we will definitely get into, or just get your physical health in order, the mechanics they discuss are completely universal.
So our mission today for this deep dive is to take this conversation apart piece by piece and really extract that blueprint.
Unpack it all.
Right. We're going to unpack the specific mechanics of habit formation. We're going to look at some major mindset shifts and some really specific, almost highly technical skill acquisition methods.
We're going to get into the weeds.
We are. We're going to talk about a concept called the dip, the idea of cognitive friction, a really intense technique called shadowing, and something that I found absolutely delightful called a baking syndicate.
The baking syndicate is easily my absolute favorite part of this whole source.
It sounds so serious.
It sounds like an underground crime ring, but it's actually this brilliant masterclass in behavioral psychology.
We will definitely get to the bread mafia later.
Yeah.
But before we get to the solutions, I think we need to start with the pain. Let's start with the crash.
The inevitable crash.
Yeah. In the source material, John and Emma spent a lot of time talking about the how. They've moved past the why are we doing this phase and straight into the how do we keep going when it gets hard phase.
Right.
And John mentioned something that he attributes to Seth Godin. He calls it the dip. Let's unpack this first. What exactly is the dip?
So the dip is that very specific, very treacherous moment when the novelty of a new endeavor just completely wears off.
The honeymoon's over.
Exactly. Think about the trajectory of learning literally anything new. When you first start out, the learning curve is pretty steep, but the feedback loop is incredibly tight.
Meaning you see results fast.
Right. You learn a few basic words of Spanish, you say hola to a waiter, and you feel like an absolute genius.
Or you go for a 1-mile jog and feel like an Olympian.
Exactly. The actual effort is relatively low, and the psychological reward is immediate and very high.
Everything is exciting. Everything feels possible.
Right. But then you hit the intermediate stage, and this is where it gets tough. In language learning, this is typically when you hit the irregular verbs or trying to understand the subjunctive mood.
The grammar table.
Yeah, the grammar. In fitness, it's when that initial rapid weight loss just stalls out. Suddenly, the amount of effort required skyrockets.
You're putting in so much more work.
You are working 10 times harder, but the visible, tangible progress slows down to an absolute crawl. You don't feel smarter anymore. In fact, you often feel significantly dumber because you are suddenly realizing just how much you actually don't know.
That is such a real, visceral feeling. It's that transition from the romanticized, cinematic version of the goal, I'm going to be fluent and charming in Paris, to the practical, boring reality of sitting alone at a desk, memorizing syntax.
Precisely. That gap where all the fun just evaporates and the endeavor turns into an absolute grind, that is the dip.
And in the source text, John is really candid about the feeling that comes with hitting the dip. He explicitly talks about being paralyzed.
Yes.
And it's a very specific type of paralysis. It's not that he doesn't actually want to do the hard work, it's that he becomes completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of tasks in front of him.
Paralysis by analysis.
I honestly feel personally attacked by that phrase. I do this all the time.
I think we all do. When you look up at this massive mountain of things you still need to learn. Grammar rules, vocabulary, syntax, or if you're in a completely different context, like learning to program, and you see all the coding languages, the libraries, the frameworks.
It's too much.
It is. Your brain literally just shuts down. The amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain, interprets that extreme ambiguity and that massive volume of information as a literal threat.
A threat to your survival.
Basically, yeah. So what do we do when faced with that threat? We retreat into planning.
Oh, the planning trap. That is my safe space. I will gladly spend 3 entire hours researching the absolute perfect workout plan, reading endless reviews of gym bags online, making a beautifully color-coded calendar on my computer, and then spend absolutely 0 minutes actually working out.
That is the classic trap. You are substituting the feeling of productivity for actual productivity.
Because planning feels like work.
It does. It feels productive. It releases a little hit of dopamine, but it is actually just a very sophisticated form of procrastination. It is a coping mechanism to avoid the pain and the friction of the dip.
But what is really interesting in this dialogue is how Emma responds to this. She doesn't just offer John a generic pep talk.
Right. She doesn't say, just push through it.
She doesn't say, hey, just believe in yourself, you can do it. She pivots immediately away from that internal psychology and goes straight to an external solution. She moves to the physical environment.
Which brings us to the next massive concept in their discussion, environmental design.
Right. So John mentions this eternal quest he's on for minimalism. Now, I have to say, usually when I hear the word minimalism, I immediately picture someone living with exactly one fork, sitting in a stark, white, empty room with a very serious expression on their face.
The extreme lifestyle minimalism.
Yeah, but that's not really what he's getting at here, is it?
No, not at all. He talks about the minimalist aesthetic, but the actual function of it is the key takeaway. He says something really profound. He says, a cluttered environment fosters a cluttered mind.
Okay, so it's about focus.
Yes. The core concept he is driving at is the removal of something called cognitive friction.
Cognitive friction. That sounds like an advanced physics term. Let's really break that down for the listener.
Okay, imagine your willpower is a battery. A very small, fairly unreliable battery that naturally drains throughout the course of your day.
Right.
Every single decision you have to make, every minor obstacle you have to figure out how to overcome, drains just a little bit of that battery's charge.
Even small things.
Especially small things. Cognitive friction is anything in your physical or digital environment that adds an unnecessary step or a mental hurdle between you and the positive action you actually want to take.
And John gives the most perfect, relatable, tiny example of this in the text, the guitar pick.
The guitar pick analogy is just brilliant because it is so small, yet the consequences of it are so huge. He says, if I have to spend 10 minutes searching for my guitar pick, I've lost the willpower to practice before I've even begun.
That is profound in its simplicity. Because it's not that he physically cannot practice because he had to look for a little piece of plastic. He's a grown adult. He can spend 10 minutes looking for a pick.
Right.
It's that the mental energy required to start, what you might call the activation energy, was entirely wasted on the search itself.
Exactly. Activation energy is actually a term borrowed from chemistry. It's the minimum amount of energy required to start a chemical reaction.
Okay.
In habit formation and behavioral design, you want the activation energy to be as close to zero as possible for your good habits.
Make it easy.
Right. If your guitar is zipped up in its heavy case, shoved deep in the back of the closet, buried under a giant pile of winter laundry, and you also can't find the pick, the activation energy is massive.
Your brain just does the math.
It does the math instantly and says, nah, that's too expensive energy-wise. Let's just sit on the couch and watch Netflix.
But if you flip that scenario, what if the guitar is sitting out on a beautiful stand right in the middle of the living room with the pick already wedged into the strings?
Then the activation energy is basically zero. You might just pick it up without even making a conscious decision to do it. You might walk past it, pick it up, and play a chord just because it's there. Zero friction.
So you are intentionally curating an environment that is highly conducive to success.
Yes.
You aren't relying on your willpower battery being fully charged at 7 p.m. after a long workday. You are relying on the design of your room.
That's a great way to summarize it. You are outsmarting your own natural laziness. You're designing a space where it is literally easier to do the desired thing than to actively avoid doing the thing.
I absolutely love that distinction. Okay, so we've cleaned up our room, we found the guitar pick, we set up the stand. The physical space is perfectly primed and ready. But Emma points out that the physical space isn't actually the only problem area. There's also the internal mental space.
Right, because mental clutter can be just as paralyzing as physical clutter, if not more so.
Which brings us to a word that usually makes very pragmatic, logic-driven people like John in the source text roll their eyes so hard they get a headache. Mindfulness.
Oh, yes. The M word.
In the source, John is very, very honest about his reaction to this. He explicitly calls it esoteric. He essentially says it's way too abstract for his pragmatic brain to find useful. And I think a huge portion of listeners can completely relate to that deep skepticism.
Absolutely.
It just feels a bit, I don't know, woo-woo.
It's a very common, very understandable reaction because culturally we often associate the word mindfulness with burning incense, chanting mantras, or sitting cross-legged on a mountaintop for weeks on end.
Right. It feels completely disconnected from the actual real work of getting things done, learning a hard skill, or maintaining productivity.
But Emma does something incredibly smart here in their dialogue. She basically rebrands the entire concept for him. She completely strips the mysticism out of it.
She really does. She calls it cognitive presence.
Which is a much more palatable clinical term for an analytical mind to digest. She argues that mindfulness, at its absolute core, is simply the direct antidote to operating on autopilot.
And autopilot is the ultimate enemy of learning. We all do it constantly. She gives this great example in the text. She talks about listening to a podcast, maybe even someone listening to this deep dive right now. But mentally, you are completely elsewhere, like drafting a stressful email to your boss.
Or you're replaying some argument you had with a friend 3 years ago in the shower, or you're intensely worrying about what ingredients you need to buy to make dinner.
And what's the result of that?
Zero absorption, absolutely none. You played the audio, the actual sound waves physically hit your eardrums, but the information never encoded into your brain's memory centers because you weren't cognitively present.
So in this specific context, mindfulness isn't about clearing your mind of all earthly thoughts and reaching nirvana. It's just about directing your focus very intentionally. It is intentional listening.
Precisely. If you are trying to learn a new language or really trying to understand any complex, dense concept, you fundamentally cannot multitask.
Because multitasking doesn't exist.
Right. Multitasking is a well-debunked myth. What you are actually doing is rapid task switching. You are bouncing back and forth between two things and doing both of them poorly.
You're just draining that willpower battery faster.
Exactly. So cognitive presence just means you are fully 100% there for the single task at hand. And establishing this presence is actually the critical foundation for the next major concept they discuss, because they move into a very specific, incredibly high-focus technique. And you simply cannot execute this next step if you are drifting on autopilot.
Yes. This is the part where we really get into the weeds, and I love it. We are going to do a deep technical dive into a method that they call shadowing.
Shadowing.
Now, when this first comes up, John jokes that it sounds like private detective work, like he's in a black and white noir film following someone down a dark, rainy alley.
It does have a mysterious ring to it.
It does. Yeah. But what actually is shadowing in the practical context of accelerated learning?
Shadowing is an absolute powerhouse of a technique for language acquisition, but the underlying neurological principles actually apply to other physical skills too. Explicitly defined, it is the act of listening to a native speaker and repeating what they say simultaneously.
Wait, let me stop you right there to clarify. Simultaneously, as in at the exact same time, not listen to the sentence, pause the tape, and then repeat it.
No. And that distinction is absolutely critical to why the method works. If you listen to a phrase, pause the audio, and then repeat it back, you are relying heavily on your short-term working memory. You are hearing the sentence, analyzing it, storing it temporarily, thinking about the grammar rules, and then trying to intellectually reproduce it. It becomes a purely academic, intellectual exercise.
Right.
In true shadowing, you are attempting to speak over the audio, or maybe just a tiny fraction of a split second behind it, kind of like a real-time echo. You are mimicking the flow, the speed, the exact tone in real time.
That sounds incredibly difficult. Honestly, that sounds like trying to rub your tummy and pat your head while reciting the alphabet backward on a unicycle.
It is extremely difficult. It creates a massive cognitive load on your brain, which is exactly why that cognitive presence we just discussed is an absolute prerequisite.
You can't shadow while drafting an email.
It's impossible. You can't shadow on autopilot. But the fundamental reason it is so highly effective is that it forces a shift in your brain. It shifts your focus away from the syntax, which is the analytical side, the grammar, the rules, and moves it to the pure physicality of the language.
The physicality.
Yeah.
In the source text, Emma mentions training the mouth muscles. I have to admit, I've never really thought about speaking a language as a physical, muscular activity.
But it entirely is. You have to think about it like going to gym class, but specifically for the muscles in your mouth, your tongue, your vocal cords.
Right.
Every single language requires fundamentally different muscle movements. They require different tongue placements against the teeth or palate. French, for example, requires you to use your lips and nasal passages in ways that English speakers never do. Mandarin requires incredibly precise tonal control from the vocal cords.
That makes a lot of sense.
So shadowing forces your physical apparatus to match the intonation, the rhythm, the prosody, essentially the melody of the target language. You are forced to stop intellectually agonizing over what does this specific word mean, and instead you start physically feeling, how does this sound actually feel to produce in my mouth?
And while discussing this, Emma brings up this fascinating linguistic idea of minimal pairs. What exactly are minimal pairs?
Minimal pairs are two words that sound almost perfectly identical to a non-native ear, but they actually have completely different meanings based on one tiny sound shift. The classic English example she gives in the text is the difference between the word ship and the word sheep.
Ship and sheep. Okay, sitting here paying attention, I can hear the difference clearly. But in the middle of a fast-spoken sentence in a loud room, I could easily see how someone might miss it.
Exactly. And here is where the science gets really fascinating. As we grow into adults, we all suffer from a neurological phenomenon called categorical perception.
Categorical perception.
Yes. Our brains become incredibly ruthlessly efficient at filtering out ambient sounds that don't exist in our own native language.
To save energy.
Exactly, to save processing power. If your native language doesn't have a distinct difference between a short I sound and a long E sound, your brain eventually just lumps all those frequencies together into one single bucket. You literally go neurologically deaf to the nuance. The sound hits your ear, but your brain ignores the difference.
That is wild. So our brains are actively censoring the incoming acoustic data based on our native language.
Yes, 100%. It's an efficiency mechanism. But shadowing forces your brain to basically reopen that closed file folder.
Because you have to say it out loud.
Right. Because you have to produce the exact sound instantly, you force your brain to actually notice the minute difference. You force yourself to consciously hear the raw data that your brain usually automatically filters out. It physically turns you from a passive consumer of sound into an active participant in the soundscape.
It sounds super intense, but I can see why it's so effective. It's basically moving from studying a topic to actually performing the topic.
That is a brilliant way to put it. It is absolutely a performance. And speaking of performance, let's look at the underlying motivation behind all of this intense work. Because why on earth is John voluntarily doing this to himself?
Right, why put yourself through the cognitive load? Let's pivot to that. John is learning Spanish, but he also talks at length about his deep fascination with Japan. And this part of the conversation was incredibly revealing because it highlights how motivation actually works on a psychological level. It's not just about utility for him, is it?
No, not at all. In linguistics and psychology, there are generally two distinct types of motivation when learning something hard: instrumental and integrative.
Okay, break those down.
Instrumental motivation is purely transactional. It's saying, I want to learn English so I can get a promotion at work, or I need to learn Python to pass this exam. It is strictly a means to an end.
Right, a tool.
But John displays what we call integrative motivation. In the text, he talks so passionately about the juxtaposition of ancient tradition and hypermodern technology in Japan. He is profoundly captivated by the culture itself, not just the utility of the language.
He mentions specifically that he wants to learn the language so that he can show respect.
And that right there is the key differentiator between someone who casually learns a few phrases and someone who truly commits to mastery. The motivation isn't transactional. It's not, I give you the correct Japanese words and you give me a bullet train ticket.
It's deeper.
It's highly relational. He deeply understands that Japanese society is fundamentally built on concepts of reverence and courtesy. By taking the time to learn the language, he is actively participating in that cultural value system. He isn't just trying to be a competent tourist, he is actively trying to be a respectful guest.
That really deepens the why. But Emma suggests a very practical way to deepen the how by utilizing this cultural interest. She introduces the concept of synergy.
Yes.
Now, usually when I hear the word synergy, I think of some awful buzzword that middle managers use in boring corporate boardrooms. We really need to synergize our paradigms. It usually means absolutely nothing. But how is she defining and using it here?
She draws a really sharp contrast between true synergy and the old idiom of killing two birds with one stone. Killing two birds with one stone usually implies doing two completely separate, unrelated things at the exact same time, just to save minutes on the clock, like listening to a depressing news podcast while washing the dinner dishes.
Which goes back to the multitasking myth we talked about.
Exactly. But true synergy implies that the two activities actually actively help each other. They amplify one another. The sum becomes greater than the parts.
Give us the specific example she uses from the source.
Japanese cinema.
Yeah.
She points out that if John sits down and watches a classic film, like Seven Samurai, he is obviously practicing his auditory listening skills. That's the language bird, so to speak. But simultaneously, he is intently observing the physical body language, the specific angles of the bowing, the use of silence, the hierarchical social dynamics.
That's the cultural norms bird.
Right. And here's the synergy. He is seeing the language operating in its natural intended habitat.
They feed into each other.
Perfectly. The culture explains the language, and the language explains the culture. You really can't grasp why a character suddenly switches to a highly specific, humble verb form unless you visually see them kneeling respectfully before a feudal lord. The visual, cultural context completely unlocks the complex grammar rule. That is true synergy. You aren't just memorizing a dry vocabulary list on an app. You are visually and auditorily absorbing an entire world.
I really love that approach because it makes the whole grueling learning process feel significantly less like studying for a test and much more like actual immersion.
It completely removes the friction.
Yeah, because watching an amazing movie is inherently fun. It naturally helps you survive the dip we talked about earlier because you are actually enjoying the daily process, not just gritting your teeth and waiting for some far-off end result.
And tying it back to neurochemistry, it connects directly back to dopamine. If the daily method of learning is intrinsically enjoyable, you are statistically far, far less likely to quit.
Okay, so let's recap where we are in the blueprint. We have the physical environment set up and decluttered. We have the hardcore technical skills with the shadowing technique. And we have the deep cultural motivation firing through synergy. Now let's shift gears and talk about what happens internally, inside the mind, before any physical action even begins.
The preparation phase.
Right. Let's get into the section on visualization.
This is another massive concept that John explicitly borrows from the high-stakes world of elite athletics. We've all heard the stories. Olympic downhill skiers, professional golfers, NBA players at the free throw line. They all vividly visualize the absolute perfect execution of the movement before they ever physically move a muscle.
Right. They run the entire race in their mind before the starting gun even goes off. They literally play the movie in their head.
Yes. And John takes this elite athletic tool and applies it directly to his very corporate professional life, specifically preparing for these high-pressure senior management presentations he has to give.
And he describes a very specific, deliberate routine in the text.
He does. He talks about closing his eyes in a quiet space beforehand. He actively visualizes the faces of the senior executives in the audience actually nodding along with his points. He clearly hears his own voice speaking smoothly and articulately without any stumbling. He mentally summons the physical feeling of confidence in his chest and his posture.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate here. It sounds a little bit like just positive daydreaming. Is there actual hard science behind doing this, or is it just the power of positive thinking?
No, there is a very surprising, very robust amount of neuroscience backing this up. When you vividly and intensely visualize a physical action or a scenario, your brain actually activates many of the exact same neural pathways and motor cortex regions as it does when you are physically performing the action in reality.
But really, so your brain kind of doesn't know the difference?
To a significant extent, yes. Your central nervous system has a remarkably hard time distinguishing between a highly vivid, sensory-rich visualization and a genuinely lived experience. It is literal mental rehearsal. You are essentially debugging your brain's software before you actually run the program in public.
That is incredible.
But the real tangible benefit, which John clearly points out in their conversation, is how effectively this practice dismantles imposter syndrome.
Oh, that is huge. Imposter syndrome is that awful, creeping internal voice constantly whispering, you don't actually belong in this room, you have no idea what you're doing, you're going to mess this up, and everyone is finally going to realize you're a total fraud.
Exactly. And the physiological response to that voice is terrible. If you walk into a high-stakes boardroom presentation thinking, I'm going to fail, your body language will naturally be closed off, your vocal cords will tighten, making your voice shaky, and your cortisol stress levels will be absolutely through the roof.
Setting yourself up for failure.
You're guaranteeing it. But if you have already lived the successful presentation vividly in your mind 5 different times that same morning, you are walking into that room carrying a literal memory of success, even though the actual event hasn't technically happened yet in chronological time.
You are artificially priming your brain for confidence.
Yes. You are overriding the fear response with rehearsed competence.
I love the way you phrased that earlier when we were prepping for this. Creating a memory of the future.
Creating a memory of the future. Yes, that is arguably the most accurate way to describe what visualization actually achieves neurologically.
So we've covered a tremendous amount of internal solo architecture today. We've looked at mindset, deep visualization, organizing your personal physical environment. But toward the end of the source material, the conversation takes a really sharp, interesting turn. It moves away from the isolated individual and goes straight into the collective.
The social aspect.
Right. John talks about his plan to start volunteering at a local animal shelter, and he admits, with pretty brutal honesty, that there is a highly selfish component to his desire to volunteer.
I really appreciated his candor there, because societally, we almost always frame volunteering as this purely selfless, altruistic sacrifice. But John accurately recognizes his own psychological needs. He realizes he desperately needs community to stay grounded. He says very bluntly, solitary goals are just harder to maintain.
Because fundamentally, we are social creatures. We are pack animals.
We absolutely are. And when you are trying to drastically change your life or build a new habit or learn something incredibly difficult, trying to do it entirely alone in a quiet room is basically playing the game on the hardest possible difficulty setting.
You're fighting millions of years of evolutionary biology.
You are. So John talks about actively planning to join local photography clubs, online coding forums, and language study groups. He is intentionally going out and looking for external accountability structures.
And this perfectly leads us right into the phrase that I teased at the very beginning of this deep dive. The Baking Syndicate.
The Baking Syndicate.
I just can't get over the gravity of that name. It really sounds like they are heavily armed and smuggling illicit baguettes across international borders in the dead of night.
It really does.
But in reality, it's actually just a small group of normal friends trying to make sourdough bread together. So why do Emma and John latch on to this specific idea so strongly? Why does the actual name Syndicate matter at all?
Because the language we use shapes our reality. Naming it a syndicate instantly creates a profound sense of officiality and shared identity. If you just casually text a friend and say, hey, let's try to bake some bread together sometime this month, the odds are very high it probably won't happen.
Right, life gets in the way. It's a very loose, weak intention.
Exactly. But if you formally agree to form a syndicate, if you deliberately give the group a title, if you set up a dedicated group chat, if you establish a firm weekly schedule, suddenly you are no longer just letting yourself down if you skip a week, you are directly accountable to the group. It creates a solid structural container for the new activity.
Emma has this fantastic quote in the transcript. She says, "Shared struggle makes the journey bearable. Shared success makes it meaningful."
And that gets right to the absolute core of why community accountability works. When your precious sourdough starter inevitably dies, and if you've baked, you know it absolutely will die at some point.
It's still terrible when it does.
Oh, the worst. But when it happens, you can immediately text the syndicate and laugh about the disaster together. If you were doing this entirely alone in your kitchen, that exact same failure would feel deeply discouraging.
You'd internalize it. You'd think, see,
Yeah.
I knew I was bad at this. I'm not a baker.
Exactly. But within the safety of a group, that same failure magically transforms into a funny shared war story. It becomes a bonding moment. And conversely, when you finally manage to pull that perfect, crusty, beautiful loaf out of the oven, you actually have people who understand the effort it took to celebrate that victory with you.
It's the psychological difference between just being some friends making a huge flowery mess in the kitchen and officially being a syndicate.
Yeah.
It's fundamentally about shifting your identity. You are collectively becoming a group of dedicated bakers.
Exactly. It elevates a casual, easily abandoned hobby into a strong shared identity. James Clear talks extensively about this exact phenomenon in his book Atomic Habits. The ultimate goal isn't just to physically run a marathon. The goal is to shift your identity so you become a runner. The syndicate is the social proof that helps you verify and solidify that new identity.
This is all so incredibly practical. So let's pull back and look at the really big picture here. We've been carefully pulling out all these individual fascinating nuggets from the conversation: the friction of the guitar pick, the intense focus of shadowing, the mental rehearsal of visualization, the social pressure of the syndicate. But as we get to the final section of our outline, we really start to see the grand synthesis of all these ideas. Emma beautifully refers to this as stacking the habits.
Right. She isn't just offering a random list of life hacks. She provides a complete structural architecture. Let's actually review that entire stack from top to bottom because it really operates as a complete interconnected ecosystem.
Let's do it. Walk us through the blueprint.
Okay, so step 1, environmental design. That is the lesson of the guitar pick. Your first move is always to ruthlessly reduce friction. You intentionally declutter your physical space and you organize your digital space so that the activation energy required to just start the task is as close to zero as physically possible.
Make the right choice the easiest choice.
Exactly. Then, step 2, focus. That encompasses the mindfulness and the visualization techniques. You don't just jump in cold. You get your brain fully present and in the right neurological gear before you hit the gas pedal. You actively fight autopilot and you intentionally create that memory of the future to banish imposter syndrome.
Getting the internal state right.
Right. Then we move to step 3, technique. That's the shadowing. Once your environment and mind are primed, you use extremely high-intensity active recall methods to actually acquire the target skill. You aren't just passively studying or highlighting text, you are actively performing and sweating through the cognitive load.
Training the muscles.
Yes. And finally, step 4, accountability. That is the syndicate. You purposefully embed your new habit into a social community so that you have a safety net that prevents you from quietly quitting when you inevitably hit the pain of the dip.
When you lay it all out sequentially like that, it completely stops being this vague, fluffy New Year's resolution of, really want to learn Spanish this year, and it suddenly becomes a highly tactical, concrete battle plan.
And that is exactly the realization John comes to at the end of the transcript. The conversation entirely shifts his perspective from having a hopeful wish list to possessing a concrete execution strategy. And ultimately, that is exactly why the vast majority of people fail at their goals. They have the inspiration, they have the wish list, but they completely lack the battle plan. They lack the architecture to support the desire.
It's just genuinely impressive how Emma and John managed to casually weave all of that profound behavioral psychology into a relaxed conversation about language learning. But it really is universal. It applies to literally everything. If you want to get fit.
Yeah.
You put your gym clothes and shoes out right next to your bed the night before. That's reducing friction. You spend your drive to the gym actively visualizing the workout. That's focus. You execute the exercises with intense concentration on proper form rather than just going through the motions. That's technique. And you commit to meeting a friend there at 6 a.m. That's your syndicate.
It is a completely universal formula for human growth.
So we are nearing the very end of our deep dive today. And the source material closes out with one final piece of overarching philosophy. And I honestly think this might be the most crucial part of the entire discussion. Because let's be real, after listening to all of this today, the shadowing, the syndicates, the mentalism, the activation energy, it is incredibly easy to feel that exact same overwhelming paralysis we talked about at the beginning.
Oh, absolutely. It's a massive amount of information to process.
Feels like a mountain of new things to do.
Yeah.
Now I had to clean my whole house, learn how to visualize like an Olympian, and go find a bread syndicate.
Yeah.
It's just way too much. But Emma provides the perfect antidote to that overwhelm right at the end. She says, and I quote, "The goal is not perfection tomorrow."
The goal is to be just 1% better than you were today.
The 1% rule.
It is the classic principle of compound interest, but applied directly to daily personal development. You absolutely do not need to perfectly declutter your entire house, achieve fluency in Japanese, and launch a baking mafia all by tomorrow morning.
That would be a recipe for total burnout.
Complete burnout. You just need to be slightly marginally better than you were yesterday. Did you manage to just move the guitar out of the closet and put it on a stand? Good. That is your 1% improvement for the day. Did you do literally 30 seconds of active shadowing while watching a movie? Good. That's another 1%.
It takes all the heavy, suffocating pressure off. It makes this massive architecture actually livable and sustainable. You aren't trying to build an entire cathedral in a single afternoon. You are literally just focusing on laying one single brick as perfectly as you can today.
Exactly. It's entirely about the direction you are heading, not your current speed. As long as you are consistently moving 1% forward, over time, the math guarantees that you are winning.
So here's the question for you, the person listening right now. We have thrown a massive amount of conceptual architecture at you today. We've got the guitar pick, the intense shadowing, the mental visualization, the accountability of the syndicate. What is the single one element you're going to pick up and use today?
Just pick one.
Just one. Are you going to clear off that cluttered desk to lower your friction? Are you going to sit quietly for 2 minutes and visualize how your difficult meeting is going to go tomorrow? Or are you going to finally text that friend and officially start your own syndicate?
Don't try to build the whole system at once. Just pick one brick, lay it down, and start building.
And as you think about which brick to choose, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to just kind of mull over today. If this blueprint we've discussed is really the key to sustained growth, what if all those past failures in your life, all the abandoned hobbies, the unused gym memberships, the dusty language books, what if absolutely none of those were actually failures of your character? What if you were never actually lazy, but you were simply operating inside of bad architecture?
That changes everything.
It really does. I think I'm personally going to go see if I can find my guitar pick. I'm pretty sure it's been lost in a box in the garage for about 3 years now. I think I finally know which box it's in.
I think I'm going to focus on the community aspect. I'll definitely join a syndicate. Maybe not for baking, though. Maybe podcasting syndicate.
Well, I think we are already in one of those. Thank you all so much for listening to the deep dive today. We really hope this blueprint helps you finally build something amazing.
Keep learning, everyone.
And we will see you next time.